Hello, and welcome to the sixth episode of Raising Capital 101, where we will be discussing the ins and outs of raising capital, what to do, and what not to do if you're planning to get some investors interested in a project of yours. I'm Tom Voekler, and I'm joined today by my colleagues John Watson and Mehanna Borostyan. Let's start with Mehanna. What is a private placement? I know we touched a little bit on in a previous webcast, but let's dive a little deeper.
Sure. So a private placement is a private offering of securities such as stock or bonds to any type of investors. There can be some limits on that. We'll jump into that later. And it doesn't need to be publicly registered. It doesn't need to go through SEC scrutiny. It's not a public offering the way that we think of it, as buying stocks off of the NASDAQ or something akin to that. And so there's less regulatory burden on sponsors in selling these securities because they don't have to pass that level of public SEC scrutiny that other registered and public offerings have to meet and surpass.
Excellent. Well, John, why is it important to have an exemption from registration requirements, mostly under the Securities Act of 1930?
Yeah, that's important because as a starting point, any offer or sale of securities in the United States has to be registered with the SEC under the Securities Act. And we went over what is a security in another episode, but it's a very broad definition, and offer and sale are broad definitions as well. So the starting point is you have to register your offering and then report to the SEC thereafter. But you avoid all of that if you fit into one of the several exemptions from the reporting requirements of the Securities Act. And we'll get into the different exemptions that are available today, but each has its own pros and cons and its own rules that you have to follow in order to benefit from the exemption.
No, that's great. And obviously most of the private placements, especially the ones we deal with, fall under an exemption provided under Regulation D, which is also issued under that Securities Act by the SEC. So let's discuss the relevant provisions. There's rules that are promulgated under Regulation D. You have Rule 504 and 506. John, you want to tell us what kind of a 504 rule allows you to do?
Yeah, Rule 504, as you say, under Reg D, under the Securities Act, provides a safe harbor for issuers. Like the other exemptions, there are benefits, there are cons, and there are requirements. So Rule 504, you can raise up to $10 million in a 12-month period. One of the benefits is that you can accept investments from any type of investor. And we're going to talk more about this, but some offerings are limited to accredited investors, investors that are larger, more sophisticated, et cetera. Not the case with Rule 504. You can accept investments from any type of investor. One of the big downsides of Rule 504 is that offerings made under that exemption are still subject to state security requirements, also known as blue sky laws. So if you're engaging in an offering that is taking place in multiple states, you will probably be subject to multiple state security regulators and their review and scrutiny. So for that reason, it's not as popular as the other Reg D exemptions. And we'll talk a little bit more about those as we go.
So, Mehanna, let's talk about Rule 506, because that's obviously the one that most people hear about and talk about when they're talking about a private placement.
Yeah, so Rule 506 really is the main, I think, private exemption that sponsors use under Regulation D. Unlike 504, you can sell to an unlimited number of investors, which is a huge benefit for sponsors. And then promulgated under that rule, you really have two options. You have a 506B option, which has certain limitations and certain benefits to some sponsors, and then 506C, which I think is probably becoming the more common type of exemption, which has benefits as well. The most important probably being that you can use general solicitation under 506C, and so sponsors can access a wider breadth of investors and sell securities through certain networks that aren't otherwise accessible through 506B.
What are some of the general frameworks to do a 506 offering? What does a sponsor have to do to have a valid 506, whether it's a B or a C?
Yeah, so they have to what we call a private placement memorandum, which essentially categorizes all disclosure that is required pursuant to a 506C or 506B exemption. That includes things like details about the business, details about the securities that are being offered, and then risks about the investment. And this is really meant to protect investors who come in through these unregistered offerings. So a lot of time, this PPM, the main disclosure document, has all of that information, all of those risks, and is meant to be an information source for investors to protect them. You can see, some smaller issuers use what we call a big boy subscription agreement, which is essentially a private placement memorandum wrapped into the subscription agreement where an investor actually purchases the securities. But those disclosure requirements are still required for sponsors. So they still have to provide that information. And that includes providing information, after the investor has purchased the securities. So something changes in the business or with the securities, they have an obligation to update that private placement memorandum through what we refer to as a supplement.
So the SEC doesn't actually require, like it does under the Exchange Act for a public company, specific disclosures, but basically they have a couple rules and regulations. They have what they call fair and balanced. So any information you provide to investors have to be fair and balanced. Basically, you can't just use puffery and not include what Mehanna talked about, some of the risks. And then the other is to protect the sponsor from liability. And that general framework, the SEC says, so long as you give all material information that an investor needs to make an investment decision and you don't omit any material information from that investor, then that kind of prescribes what should go in this disclosure document. We internally here use a process where we try to mimic as close as possible what a public disclosure document would include without going too in depth or being too onerous in what is required from our clients. But the best source of what the SEC requires in a public deal would probably be what is required in a private deal. So let's talk a little bit more about the difference between a 506C and a 506B. John, what is kind of the newest iteration of 506 in this C, and why is it being used predominantly?
So Rule 506C is the newer flavor there. It's about a decade old. And some things they have in common, as Mehanna said, you can raise an unlimited amount of capital from an unlimited amount of accredited investors. 506C, the big change was that you're allowed to engage in general advertising and general solicitation. So obviously that's a big deal. One way that could look is by putting your offering on your website. And as you say, you still have to include all material information. You can't be misleading, certainly can't be fraudulent, but you can engage in general advertising. The flip side to that is that issuers that proceed under 506C have to take, quote, reasonable steps, end quote, to confirm that the investors are in fact accredited investors. And there's a whole list of accredited investors. So the way you're going to confirm that is going to be different on the type of accredited investor that you're dealing with. But there is that enhanced burden there. And we'll get into more depth on that. But some issuers have chosen to continue to proceed under 506B. It's still around and still used quite frequently because it's worked for them in the past and they don't want to take on that extra burden. The question of whether it really is a large burden on the issuers, that's another topic. But
that's a great teaser because our next webcast is actually going to be us going into detail on 506, and so we're going to spend a lot of time on kind of those burdens and why one would be used versus the other. And the same thing with accredited investors. We're going to kind of go into much deeper how you can be considered an accredited. But Mehanna, what is kind of a basic framework of what an accredited is and why did the SEC come up with this idea?
Yeah, I think that's important. Why did the SEC want to set some guidelines to who these securities through these unregistered private offerings are being sold to? And I think that's really to protect the investor. And so the criteria for an accredited investor is those that have a high net worth, so over $1 million for an individual. And then there are income requirements. So these are right? So you can have a high net worth of $1 million, income requirement of at least $200,000 for an individual, $300,000 for a household. And that protection is really so that these private offerings and an investment in these private offerings is usually a liquid, right? So you want to ensure that these investors have the proceeds to be able to invest in these private offerings and risk their investment. You don't want somebody who is investing, 50% of their assets in an investment like this and are left unprotected because these private offerings aren't highly regulated. And then there are other criteria to become an accredited investor. So those could be being a registered investment advisor, a broker dealer, a bank or investment company, or similar entity with a certain amount of assets. So that criteria follows the same thinking of the SEC, which is we want to ensure that the investors who come into these private offerings are sophisticated and have the assets in order to protect themselves and their investment.
Oh, that's really good. And next time we'll go a little deeper into some of those and why and how some of those tests are done. So that's a great primer on that. So outside of kind of 506, how does a private placement usually operate? Because I would probably venture a guess that the vast majority of securities deals that are done kind of, I hate to say under the table, but do not follow 506. Mehanna, what are your thoughts on just kind of a private placement?
Yeah, so I think there are other exemptions, right? So Rule 144A allows the sale of securities to qualified institutional buyers. And you'll see with all of these exemptions, it's kind of the SEC's same thinking of who is protected, who doesn't need the protection of the SEC. And so qualified institutional buyers kind of fall into that. Another one, which is really interesting, is the intrastate offerings. John, I know that you have a little bit of experience in this, but it's basically offerings to a limited number of investors in a single state. John, did you want to piggyback on that just to give some more color?
Sure. The intrastate exemption, it's kind of what it sounds like, where the offer and sale are all taking place within the same state. And that can work well for a smaller issuer that has a sort of limited pool of investors that are, again, all within the same state. But if you have investors from multiple states, kind of like with Rule 504, you are opening yourself up to regulation under multiple state security regimes, and you can't take advantage of the intrastate exemption. So that would be a big one for smaller issuers who all their investors are in the same state where the business is headquartered.
Another exemption is Section 4A2. So this allows the sale of securities to a limited number of sophisticated investors. Same reasoning as basically the standard for accredited investors is that, these certain types of investors have the financial wherewithal to understand and risk the investment. And the SEC, I don't think, has ever really defined exactly what that means for Section 4A2, but I think a lot of issuers take advantage of that to issue securities.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good wrap for today. You can tell there is a lot that goes on with regards to private placements, and you can quickly run afoul of either some SEC rules or regulations or state regulatory requirements, or quite frankly, if you're distributing and using somebody to distribute your product, you may run afoul of FINRA. So we're going to go into more detail in future episodes on each of those and how we can help you navigate this successfully. So we hope you understand a little bit more about private offerings. Each situation is different, and making sure that you're raising capital correctly is very, very important. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact us. You can also visit our securities and corporate governance and REITs web pages at williamsmullen.com. There you can find out a lot about our team as well as all of our great legal alerts. And finally, be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can be notified on our next episodes, because we're going to go into more detail on 506, and we're going to go more detail in the public and some of the regulations regarding that. I'd like to thank my colleagues and hope you have a great day.